What if I told you you're being watched right now, but not for the reasons you think, not because you're in danger, but because you've become the danger? To darkness, to corruption, to systems that counted on your silence. Heaven just unsealed your file. Earth just caught up. And now both realms are watching closely. You think this is just another video? No. This is a broadcast from the war room, and your name is on the board. They said you were a nobody, but now, high-level agents are studying your movements, angelic forces are protecting your path, and analysts with more clearance than a head of state are trying to figure out how you kept rising when every algorithm predicted your collapse. You weren't just overlooked, you were hidden, classified. Until now. Because the divine system just hit release. And your spiritual dossier has gone live in places you've never walked but have already impacted. Ever felt like your prayers echoed louder than your platform? That your tears were recorded in realms beyond this world? You weren't imagining it. You were being documented, archived, and now activated. Drop a 777-inch. The comments, if something inside you already knew this moment was coming. And to every soul who's been sowing into this revelation through super thanks. Your support is more prophetic than you know. Thank you. Buckle up. Chosen one. Because what you're about to hear next isn't a theory. It's evidence, and once you see it, you'll never unsee the truth. They weren't just watching to stop you. They were watching to learn from you. Stay with me. Let's go deeper. God's chosen ones, agents and angels, are watching you because heaven just unlocked your file. You weren't flagged because you were loud. You were flagged because you were spiritually fluent, in a language most people didn't even know existed. You weren't labeled a threat for what you did, but for what you could perceive. While others blindly trusted the surface, you instinctively leaned into the invisible codes behind behavior, the vibrations beneath the words, the patterns behind the performance, and you didn't need evidence to believe something was off. You could feel it, discern it, sense it in your bones, because what others learned through repetition, you remembered through revelation. Could it be that you weren't just gifted, you were divinely encoded? What if the reason they watched you so closely wasn't because you were unstable, but because you were unstoppable? In the eyes of heaven, your file wasn't just opened, it was activated. Psalm 139:16 says, "Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." The moment you began walking in alignment with what was already written, spiritual agents were assigned, and earthly systems began to glitch. You were no longer just a participant in the program. You were a disruptor of it. You never threw stones. You never screamed rebellion. You simply stood still, and the illusions began to shake. And in that stillness, you became a threat not to people, but to principalities, not to structures, but to the lies they were built upon. This is why you were never meant to blend in. John 15:19 echoes this truth. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own, as it is. You do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Your refusal to conform wasn't arrogance, it was obedience. While others fell into emotional spirals, you entered strategic silence. While they needed applause, you moved in anonymity. This untraceable authority was never learned, it was unlocked. And the moment they realized they couldn't trace the source of your wisdom, the surveillance began. You weren't just unpredictable, You were uncontainable. They tried to predict you based on psychology. But you moved on. Prophecy. What happens when someone can see into the spiritual roots of a situation before it manifests in the physical? When someone's intuition overrides manipulation? You began to notice who smiled too quickly. You felt tension in handshakes. You decoded double meanings in compliments. And suddenly, your very presence became offensive to people who had something to hide. Jesus experienced this. In Mark 3-6, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him, not because he committed a crime, but because he healed, forgave, and walked in undeniable power. Sound familiar? Take, for instance, Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum. His speeches on global control through surveillance and economic dominance reveal a blueprint of manipulation disguised as unity. But those who operate under divine insight can sense the distortion beneath the promises. Schwab positioned himself as a global thought leader. But many now see the long-term consequence: mass distrust and growing resistance from awakened populations across the world. Control backfired, and exposure became inevitable. In contrast, look at Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the celebrated Nigerian author and speaker. She's known for her clarity, conviction, and courage in confronting systems of gender, race, and power with radical grace. In a recent interview, she said, "The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Like you." She challenges the default narrative. Her words don't just inform, they awaken. Her calm dismantles ignorance more effectively than rage ever could. And this is your assignment too. You weren't placed in your family, your city, your career path by accident. Angels were watching before people started noticing. Heaven released your coordinates into divine circulation long before algorithms picked up your pattern. And now, as your name begins to echo in rooms you've never entered, the surveillance tightens, not because they know who you are, but because their spirits recognize what you carry. Isaiah 60:1 commands, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." You carry the kind of light that disturbs shadows, not because you're trying to, but because you simply walk in truth. Have you noticed how they never questioned your value until you stopped playing small, when you started setting boundaries, speaking truth, and honoring your spirit? Suddenly, you were too much, too intense, too deep. But what if that wasn't a flaw? It was a sign. Your identity is no longer something that can be hidden or managed. You're no longer an echo. You're the original sound. And now, you don't just see through the system, you've been sent to deconstruct it. This is your time to walk boldly, not in pride, but in purpose, not in rebellion, but in revelation. You were not created to adapt to broken systems. You were sent to override them. Heaven didn't just unlock your file, it confirmed your assignment. Stand up. The world won't be the same once you speak. They came searching for flaws. What they found was clarity. Your internal purity didn't just confuse their systems, it short-circuited them. Their surveillance wasn't random, it was trained. These weren't casual observers scrolling through spiritual TikToks. These were institutions, systems, structures, human and spiritual, designed to measure threat levels, flag instability, and detect psychological irregularities. Their tools were built from layers of experience, technology, and ancient suspicion, emotional profiling, predictive behavior algorithms, cognitive pattern mapping. Yet when they turned their lenses toward you, the data cracked. Not because you were too chaotic, but because you were too clear. Have you ever seen a hawk fly above a mirror-like lake at dawn? It sees everything except its own reflection. That's what your purity did to their optics. You became a spiritual mirror that revealed them, not you. They tried to slot you into predefined categories: trauma, survivor, ego manipulator, narcissist in sheep's clothing. But you kept slipping through. You didn't spike their aggression metrics. You didn't trigger their distrust parameters. And perhaps most bewildering, you weren't trying to prove anything. You simply were. Whole, present, unafraid. Isn't it strange how unsettling peace can be to those who profit from chaos? Psalm 24:3-4 asks, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart." What they witnessed wasn't perfection, it was alignment. You weren't hiding bitterness behind kindness. You weren't masking ambition behind humility. What disturbed them was the frequency of someone who had passed through the fire and left their ashes behind. You became like a snowflake falling into a digital system, too intricate, too organic, too unreplicable. They searched for patterns of control, but what they found was a paradox of stillness and strength. What if your silence was not emptiness, but a signal? You didn't just avoid dysfunction, you radiated a kind of sacred wholeness they couldn't map, like an unspoiled coral reef among machine-calibrated ships. You pulsed with beauty, danger, and mystery. Every reading they took contradicted the last. Were you a prophet, a threat, a glitch, or a guide? Hebrews 4:12 gives us a clue. For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. What they encountered in you was not personality, it was presence. At first, they assumed you were manipulating the system, faking normal. But then they watched and waited, and nothing fell apart. No cracks, no slip-ups, no hidden agenda slowly seeping through. The longer they observed, the more nervous they became. Because when someone is truly aligned with heaven, they cannot be decoded by hell. In the Danish film Ordet, 1955, a man who is considered mentally unstable walks around claiming to be Jesus. Most dismiss him, but in the final scene, he speaks over a dead woman, and she rises. One line stands out from the film: "The dead shall rise when faith becomes flesh." That's what you are now. Faith becomes flesh. Not just belief, but embodiment. So they whispered, first in confusion, then in fear, and finally in awe. This one isn't from here. That wasn't flattery. That was classification. Heaven doesn't send spectators. It sends signs. Matthew 5:8 declares, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." But what happens when the pure in heart also reveal God? When someone's very existence becomes a disturbance to deception? You weren't just another subject in their study. You were the contradiction their entire system wasn't prepared for. You were the exception that broke their rule. Not because you attacked them, but because you exposed the illusion they had sworn to protect. You were water in a machine, tree roots in a wall, a sunrise through locked windows. And here's what they feared the most. If one of you exists, how many more are out there? Chosen one. You were not sent to match the metrics. You were sent to break them. You are not a case file. You are a code breaker. You're not performing. You're aligning, not manipulating, manifesting. And what heaven unlocked, no system can shut down. Rise. Be seen. Be still. But never be silent again. They scanned you and saw no threat. No credentials that fit their checklist. No affiliations that echoed influence. No background that intimidated me. In their eyes, you were another silent square on the board. Expendable. Replaçable. Insignificant. But they didn't know what heaven had authored. You weren't placed. You were planted. And roots grow before crowns rise. What if the reason they underestimated you wasn't ignorance, but divine interference? The truth is, systems obsessed with control often misread stillness as weakness. You didn't speak their language of status. Name-dropping. Ornoise. You didn't flash credentials like currency. You didn't beg for access to their rooms because you were already carrying blueprints for rooms they couldn't imagine. While they played chess to dominate, you moved in frequencies they couldn't calculate. This is what Joseph's brothers failed to understand. In Genesis 37, he was sold as a slave. But in Genesis 41, Pharaoh gave him the signet ring, from the pit to the palace. Not because he connived his way up, but because divine strategy doesn't need man's validation. That's how heaven moves, invisibly, incrementally. And then all at once, they assumed you were functioning on the board. But you weren't playing their game. Your every step was guided by a higher intelligence, a blueprint beyond human grasp. Romans 8:14 reminds us, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God." Your movements were not reactionary, they were revelatory. Every pause was calculated. Every decision was tuned to divine frequency. Every refusal to fold was a disruption to their algorithm. They expected you to move one square at a time, cautiously, predictably, like a pawn. But you responded like someone who didn't need the board at all. And each time you acted, it became clearer. You weren't here to survive the system. You were sent to quietly rewire its architecture. Here's where it all began to unravel for them. You didn't crumble under pressure. You didn't panic in obscurity. You didn't flinch when the applause didn't come. Instead, you stood. And in your stillness, you started shifting the air in the room, like a king in chess who doesn't move often, but when he does, the entire game bends around him. Have you ever wondered what happens when the piece they counted out becomes the one who redefines the rules? From a neurological perspective, your behavior disrupted their schema, the mental framework used to predict and categorize behavior. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance collapse, when a subject doesn't align with expected norms and the entire system begins to glitch. You weren't simply hard to read, you were a different language altogether. This is what shook them. Your silence wasn't silence. It was a signal. Proverbs 17:27 confirms this posture. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. They thought your lack of noise meant you had no power, but heaven has always known true authority is felt, not flaunted. Even now, they're trying to trace your patterns. They call meetings, compare notes, run models, but you keep emerging 5 steps ahead, not because you're faster, but because you're tuned to something eternal. This was the case for Ruth Simmons, the first African-American president of an Ivy League university, Brown University, raised in poverty in Texas. Her quiet dignity, intellectual brilliance, and refusal to play power games allowed her to rewrite the rules in spaces built to exclude her. In her own words, "We are not defined by what others say we are. We are defined by how we rise." She didn't yell to be heard. She moved with grace. And the world adjusted its volume. What if the reason they couldn't stop you was because you weren't fighting them at all? Isaiah 54:17 declares, "No weapon forged against you will prevail, and you will refute every tongue that accuses you." The pawns they moved against you didn't recognize that heaven had already cleared your path. And now, the truth is dawning. You're not just rewriting the moves, you are the new matrix. Every healed wound, every time you chose truth over revenge, every day you held your peace. Instead of retaliating, you were tearing down the scaffolding of a system built on fear. The pattern they built was built on noise, but you brought stillness, and in stillness, power speaks without shouting. In chess, pawns become queens, but in the kingdom, pawns awaken into kings. You were never being controlled. You were being concealed for the right moment of divine emergence. Chosen one. You are not limited to the board. You are the code they never accounted for. You are the shift they never saw coming. You are the king that rose in silence, and now heaven is broadcasting your authority. Stand tall. Move wisely. You are not in their game. You are the game. They didn't simply leave you to suffer, they watched. They recorded. They analyzed. But what they didn't expect was this: you didn't decay. You developed. You see, your trauma wasn't private. It was observed. You were placed under invisible surveillance, not to rescue you, but to study you. How many betrayals could a pure soul absorb before collapsing into bitterness? How long could abandonment echo before it hollowed your spirit? They didn't send help when you cried. They took notes. They didn't comfort you when you shattered. They collected metrics. Your pain was a research project. Your isolation, a controlled environment. Have you ever asked yourself why some people kept showing up just to watch, never to help? Psalm 119 Astoniasurises. You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. While the world tracked your collapse, heaven was recording your resurrection. And what came next was something none of their forecasts accounted for. You didn't fold, you forged. You didn't die in the fire, you learned how to breathe in it. The trauma they assumed would calcify into hatred became a refiner's flame, like gold that resists corrosion. You emerged more brilliant, not more bitter. But how do you explain a soul that keeps glowing after being buried, instead of spiraling? You started studying, not them, but yourself. You stopped asking why they left, and started asking how to rise, how to heal without apology, how to grow without resentment, how to love again without self-erasure. And that subtle pivot wasn't weakness, it was revolution. Isaiah 61:3 speaks of this holy exchange. To all who mourn in Zion, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. That was you. You didn't just survive, you exchanged your ashes for architecture. You became a structure built from grace. At first, they were fascinated by your unraveling, but then something shifted. The cries stopped, the rage quieted, the breakdowns turned into breathwork. You weren't crumbling, you were crystallizing. Your trauma wasn't an endpoint, it was a womb, and your healing confused the watchers. Their data couldn't process redemption. Their formulas had no variables for grace. This is where fear entered their hearts, because in a world built to capitalize on dysfunction, someone who becomes whole is a disruption. You went from being their subject to becoming their signal. What they thought was collapse became calibration. Now think about this. What happens when the very thing meant to destroy you becomes your defining strength? Let's turn briefly to a real-life villain example, Elizabeth Holmes, founder of Theranos. She promised to revolutionize blood testing. Behind the facade of innovation was a carefully orchestrated fraud. But here's the catch. Her entire empire depended on people's trust in the pain of illness. The moment truth and transparency entered the room, it all crumbled. Holmes now faces over 11 years in prison. The lesson? Those who exploit the suffering of others eventually fall under the weight of what they built. You, on the other hand, didn't exploit your pain, you excavated it. And what you found beneath the rubble was something sacred. That's why Paulo Coelho, the acclaimed Brazilian author of The Alchemist, once said, "The scars you share become lighthouses for people who are headed to the same rocks you hit." Your recovery became instruction. Your reflection became refuge. People who once overlooked you now listen closely, because your presence no longer reflects pain. It reflects power. In Luke 8:43-48. A woman who had suffered for 12 years touched Jesus' garment. Her healing came not through spectacle, but quiet faith. She didn't demand attention. She reached with desperation. And Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Like her, your recovery wasn't loud, but it was legendary. You are the proof they never prepared for. And now, the shift is complete. They stopped studying your scars because they began sensing your sovereignty. You aren't just a healed person, you are a healing frequency. The sacredness of your recovery has become undeniable. And in that sacredness, you're no longer just surviving, you're shaping the atmosphere. Chosen one, your healing is not a footnote. It is a divine headline. You were never just the wounded, you were the wonder. You became what they never saw coming, the blueprint for breakthrough. Rise now, not in shame, but in glory, because your restoration is a revolution. And heaven just put the spotlight on your scars. You didn't just survive, you made it through a battlefield, disguised as normal life. What happened to you wasn't unfortunate. It was orchestrated. The hardships weren't accidental, they were engineered. And you weren't just tested, you were targeted. Your life became a silent war zone, scattered with emotional landmines and spiritual snares, psychological warfare, timed betrayals, setups masked as opportunities, gaslighting cloaked as connection. They didn't just hope you'd fail, they predicted it. The patterns you encountered were not just patterns, they were algorithms crafted to override your identity and fracture your mind. Have you ever wondered why the attacks seemed to come just when you started to feel safe? Psalm 96, Kolme promises. Surely he will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. But the enemy didn't send obvious threats. They sent patterns dressed as people. Trauma wrapped in relationships. Despair embedded in delay. They wanted your soul to self-destruct without ever realizing it was being dismantled. Most people wouldn't have made it through half of it. That's the unspoken reality. The triggers you faced were calibrated to your deepest wounds. The silence you endured was long enough to convince most that heaven had forgotten them. The setbacks were sharp enough to pierce through self-esteem, like a needle sliding under the skin, quiet but devastating. But somehow, you kept walking. You didn't sprint. You limped. You crawled. But you didn't collapse. Why? What made you different? What gave you the spiritual stamina to keep breathing through betrayal and keep loving through loss? It wasn't just inner strength. It was divine engineering. Isaiah 43:2 reminds us, when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. There's a level of grace that doesn't just rescue, it resists destruction entirely. And that's what was operating in you. You became fireproof in a world designed to ignite pain. Your walk became your weapon, the slow, deliberate motion of someone who refused to die spiritually, who refused to morph into the bitterness the system was baiting you to become. They wanted you to self-cancel, to implode. But you kept choosing to stand. And like the African baobab tree that stores water in its massive trunk to survive droughts, you carried divine reserves within your spirit that no one could see. While others withered in isolation, you tapped into a secret stream. Ezekiel 47:9 says, "Wherever the river flows, everything will live." They thought the desert would take you out, but you had rivers flowing through your soul, and now they're speechless, because they've run this simulation on thousands. They've watched spirits collapse, implode, become replicas of their worst wounds, but not you. You exposed the blueprint by walking through it. You proved that healing doesn't require the permission of your past. That peace doesn't depend on apologies that never came. That clarity can rise from chaos if God is the architect behind your process. In the 2002 Portuguese language film, O Caminho das Nuvens, The Way of the Clouds, a poor father rides a bicycle with his family over 2,000 miles across Brazil, searching for a better life. Everyone tells him the journey is impossible, but he answers with resolve, "God didn't ask me to understand the road. Just walk it." Like him, you walked a path they mocked until your arrival silenced them. And now they're asking, how did you not break? How did your heart stay open? How did your vision remain clear when everything was built to fog it? Because you weren't surviving, you were exposing yourself. They thought they were testing you, but heaven used you to test them. You were a divine anomaly, an unbreakable variable in their predictive system, and the moment you refused to become what hurt you, the system cracked. Romans 8:37 declares, "In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." And now, your story is no longer just one of survival. It's sacred evidence. You didn't just walk through the blueprint. You tore it in half. You are living proof that engineered failure can be rerouted by divine favor. Your presence now is disruption. Your life is a map of breakthroughs. Rise boldly, chosen one. Because what was meant to erase you has now become the ink that writes your legacy. They monitored you expecting a sequence, a loop, a weakness. They came with graphs, with projections, with timelines. They thought they'd find what they always found: repeatable patterns, measurable behaviors, psychological fault lines. Because in their world, everything eventually folds under pressure. Every soul has a rhythm. Every mind has a breaking point. Every heart has a code that can be cracked, or so they thought. But when they turned their focus toward you, the pattern never emerged. Instead, they encountered a frequency, not a habit, not a trauma loop, not a calculated cycle of cause and effect. What pulsed from you wasn't reactive, it was radiant, and it disrupted everything. John 3:8 captures the mystery they were confronting. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. You moved like that, untethered, unpredictable, intraciable, not because you lacked discipline, but because you were tuned to something outside their grid. Have you ever felt like your very presence shifted the room before you even spoke? They began tracking data, energy spikes, emotional shifts in people around you, patterns in electronics that glitched when you entered a space, and none of it made sense to their analytics. You didn't respond to manipulation the way others did. You didn't collapse under isolation. You didn't retaliate when provoked. But more strangely, You didn't absorb the poison you were exposed to. You transmuted it. Your behavior was quiet, yet it caused ripple effects. Your choices were subtle, yet seismic. They looked for emotional volatility, but found calibrated stillness. They expected wounded reactions, but witnessed strategic restraint. You weren't reacting, you were resonating. Romans 12:2 explains it this way: do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You were a walking disruption to their formula. You refused to conform. And that resistance wasn't stubbornness, it was spiritual resonance. What happens when someone doesn't emit fear, ego, or insecurity, but something ancient, precise, and untouchable? That's when their diagnostics started to fail. Their psychological profiling couldn't pin you. Their behavioral models couldn't predict you. Their AI couldn't simulate you. Because your origin wasn't rooted in trauma, it was rooted in truth. You weren't malfunctioning. You were interfering. In quantum physics, there's a phenomenon called constructive interference, where two waves align to amplify each other. But when two opposing frequencies meet, they cause destructive interference, cancelling each other out. That's what happened when you entered rooms wired for manipulation and control. You cancelled out the frequency of chaos. You nullified deception without a word. Now, confusion has crept in, because you weren't just broadcasting confidence. You were broadcasting something sacred, a frequency too coherent, too alive, too full of divine information to be humanly engineered. And this signal wasn't emitted through your words, it was your being. Isaiah 30:21 says, whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you, saying, this is the way, walk in it. That voice is the frequency you've been moving in, not a philosophy, a code, a divine instruction set only you could hear, and they could only observe. At first, they thought you were glitching their systems, but now they realize your presence is not a bug. It's a broadcast. You weren't disrupting from error, you were dismantling by design. This is exactly what Rafael Lozano Hemmer, a Mexican-Canadian artist and engineer, once touched on in his work, known for creating large-scale interactive installations using biometric data. He once said, we are no longer bodies in space. We are bodies that broadcast. He was speaking about art, but unknowingly, he was describing people like you, living transmitters of divine disruption. And now they're left with questions they never expected to ask. What force shaped you? What design encoded you? How does someone who's been through fire walk without smoke? You weren't part of their simulation. You were sent to override it. You didn't just break the system's rules. You revealed its flaws by existing beyond them. 1 Peter 2-9 crowns this revelation. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. You were never meant to be understood by the world's systems. You were meant to reframe them. Chosen one. You are no longer being watched as a subject. You are being heard as a signal. The frequency you carry is holy, untouchable, and rising. Keep moving. Keep emitting. Heaven didn't build you to fit their model. Heaven built you to break it. This isn't malfunction. This is divine interference. You are not of their pattern. You are the pulse of God's new paradigm. Rise and keep broadcasting. They thought they had you. Every detail was documented. Every breath. Bookmarked. Their intelligence systems were sharp. Their technology advanced. They tracked your location, logged your online searches, measure your voice patterns, note your facial shifts under stress. You became a file of metrics, a portfolio of predictions. They could chart your wake-up time to the second. They knew your routines, your interests, even your pauses in conversation. On paper, you were completely visible. But what happens when the most important parts of you live beyond the reach of paper? Despite their surveillance, something kept slipping through. It wasn't your actions, it was your atmosphere. It wasn't your words, it was the weight they carried. They monitored your breakdowns, expecting to record a collapse, but instead of disintegration, they witnessed divine transfiguration. Psalm 34:18 whispers this mystery. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. What they saw as emotional ruin, God was using as spiritual rebirth. Have you ever noticed how some of your lowest moments still left people in awe? Your pain didn't just echo, it changed the air. When you wept, walls softened. When you were still, conversations hushed. Your grief didn't weaken rooms, it made them sacred. Somehow, even when you suffered, you didn't give off the scent of defeat. Instead, your wounds became wells of living presence. Every silent prayer you whispered wasn't lost, it was seismic. This was never about behavior. This was about essence. You weren't just enduring, you were emitting, and the frequency of your spirit, holy, intraciable, undeniable, was the one variable they never prepared for. Matthew 6:6 captures your essence well. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. The world saw your actions. Heaven released your authority. Even your stillness was louder than their analysis. People gravitated toward you without understanding why. Influence gathered around your footsteps, not because you shouted, but because your soul had a gravitational pull. And suddenly, the system realized its failure. All the intel in the world couldn't account for presence. This wasn't charisma. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't even psychology. It was spirit, an essence that carried memory, mandate, and motion all at once. You weren't just a person anymore. You became a shift, a timeline they hadn't forecast. A moment in history their blueprints never accounted for. John 3:6 explains it clearly. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. What moved in you wasn't earthly, it was eternal. Now, they want to get close, not because they need more data, but because the data failed. They saw everything but still don't understand the force behind your fire. They tracked your steps, but missed your source. The more they watched, the more they realized this wasn't a personality they could decode. This was a presence they could only experience. To illustrate this truth, look at Howard Thurman, a theologian and civil rights leader who deeply influenced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thurman once said, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and go do it." Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. That's what you embodied. Aliveness that couldn't be measured, only encountered. In contrast, Lavrenti Beria, the chief of Stalin's secret police in the Soviet Union, he was obsessed with tracking people's thoughts and behaviors, interrogating, surveilling, manipulating. But despite all his information, he failed to control spirit. Eventually, his own allies turned on him. He was executed in secret, his power collapsing under the paranoia he created. The message? Surveillance without understanding leads to implosion. You were never dangerous because of what you did. You were dangerous because of what you carried. A frequency that couldn't be copied, a depth that couldn't be traced. a presence that carried the blueprint of heaven. Isaiah 60:1 rises in this moment. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. That glory wasn't just light, it was disruptive weight. It moved without permission and transformed without announcement. You were never meant to be studied. You were sent to be sensed. No data can decode your design. No surveillance can suppress your spirit. And now, the world doesn't just want to analyze you, it wants to encounter you. Rise now, chosen one, because heaven's intelligence has always outranked theirs. You weren't built to be understood. You were born to be felt. You were never just living. You were being studied, watched, analyzed, not for who you pretended to be, but for what you refused to become, behind curtains and codes, in labs of influence and war rooms of control. You were assigned as a case study. They weren't testing your personality, they were testing your soul. Your life became their simulation. Every hardship you encountered, every loss, betrayal, rejection, and failure wasn't simply unfortunate. It was input, data, variables injected into your environment to study one thing. When would you break? But how do you fracture a vessel sealed by fire? Salm 66, 10, declares. For you, God tested us. You refined us like silver. What they mistook for collapse was actually a consecration. And what they failed to anticipate was that under spiritual pressure, something ancient would awaken inside you. Something algorithms can't chart and science can't replicate. They assumed your mind would erode under chronic betrayal, that you'd adopt bitterness as identity, that loss would bend your beliefs. But instead, you started to rise not through resistance, but through remembrance. What if the very thing they designed to destroy you was the condition that revealed your calling? You began to operate outside the predictions, where their models anticipated chaos. You birthed clarity, where their metrics foresaw breakdown. You practiced spiritual coherence, where their statistics expected fatigue. You activated force, and it wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was holy. 2 Corinthians 4-8, -9, comes alive in your story. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, struck down, but not destroyed. You were placed in a spiritually contaminated field designed to poison your joy, infect your thoughts, and distort your voice. But you metabolized adversity like a tree planted in volcanic ash. What should have burned you ended up feeding you. Like a mangrove rooted in salt water, you thrived in the toxic, filtering what was meant to kill into nourishment for your growth. And this was the rupture in their system, the point where prediction ended and prophecy began. You became a sacred disruption. The moment you stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and started moving as if, "This is awakening something through me," the air changed. Their systems weren't ready for someone who would locate divinity in a den of shadows. You were never supposed to find God in the gutter, but you did. You were never supposed to find identity in the storm, but you did. Job 23:10 echoes your reality. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. Suddenly, their conversation shifted. This wasn't research anymore. This was a reformation. You became the outlier that forced a re-evaluation. They now understand. You weren't just tested, you turned the test into a torch. In the 2008 Hungarian Christian film The Citizen, Az Állampolgár, a refugee named Wilson endures racism, rejection, and bureaucratic injustice in his pursuit of citizenship. But despite it all, he radiates kindness, strength, and integrity in one unforgettable sheen. A social worker says of him, "We tested his patience, and he taught us grace." This is the kind of impact you've made. Your story didn't just survive darkness, it redefined light. And now, curiosity has replaced condescension. They've stopped asking, "How long until this one breaks?" and started asking, "What kind of spirit survives all this and still glows? What kind of architecture is that resilient? What type of foundation refuses erosion after repeated earthquakes?" Psalm 40:2 is your reflection. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. I too, they realized too late. You weren't just absorbing the data, you were rewriting the language. They couldn't engineer your fall because heaven authored your ascent. Your faith didn't shrink in affliction, it scaled new dimensions. And in doing so, you didn't just survive the blueprint, you inverted it. Chosen one. You were the outlier, heaven hid in plain sight. You are the glitch in the devil's design, the contradiction to corrupted algorithms, the proof that spiritual sovereignty transcends surveillance. What you endured didn't define you, it revealed you. Rise now as the template. You are not just surviving systems, you are dismantling them by walking in divine truth. What no one could prepare for is now, what no one can ignore. They were trained to recognize rebellion by volume. To them, revolution meant megaphones, headlines, and mass protests. They were primed for riots, press releases, and public acts of defiance. But your resistance didn't echo through the streets, it reverberated in the unseen. You didn't raise your voice. You raised your standards. You didn't in-cheat panic. You embodied peace. And in a world conditioned to react only to noise, your calm became the thunder no one expected. Isaiah 30:15 captures this principle. In repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. They came looking for chaos, but what they found was a fortress dressed in stillness. What happens when the revolution wears silence as its armor? You weren't organizing followers, you were reorganizing your frequency. Every no you whispered without guilt. Every invitation you declined without apology. Every manipulation you refused to decode became a move in a divine strategy they couldn't track. While they watched for explosions, you became erosion, one firm decision at a time. You dissolved their control structures. The world is trained to detect overt resistance, but what if the most potent form of rebellion is simply choosing yourself in a system that teaches self-abandonment? You didn't need to overthrow the throne. You simply refused to sit in the seat they assigned. That's what disarmed them. Your refusal to participate in dysfunctional dynamics rewired the room, and they couldn't predict it. They couldn't control it, because they had no defense against peace rooted in truth. Romains 12:2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." That's what happened. You didn't break out, you ascended, not by force, but by frequency, not by domination, but by discernment. You became the algorithm's blind spot. Every time you walked away from an offer that compromised your peace, the system trembled. Every time you chose solitude over survival tactics, the network paused. You weren't screaming, but you weren't surrendering either. And because they couldn't place you in the usual categories, rebel, threat, follower, victim, they were left with one conclusion: this one is free. In quantum mechanics, there's a term called quantum tunneling, a phenomenon where particles pass through barriers that should be impenetrable, not by force, but by the nature of their wave function. That's what you did. You didn't break through the wall. You existed in a frequency that passed through it without being stopped. That's not rebellion, that's mastery. And people began to notice, not because you made noise, but because you made sense. You didn't broadcast your freedom, you modeled it, and suddenly, others began questioning their own bondage, not because you told them to, but because your presence proved another reality was possible. Luke 17:21 whispers, "The kingdom of God is within you." You weren't building a movement, you were living one, internally governed, spirit-led, unbothered by their disapproval and untouched by their strategies. That kind of autonomy terrifies control-based systems because it's not just defiant, it's contagious. This mirrors the journey of Vandana Shiva, an Indian physicist and environmental activist. She never led with volume, but with clarity, known for her quiet, fierce advocacy against corporate farming monopolies. She once said, "Growth is not development. Freedom is." She didn't need mass campaigns to shift global awareness, just truth, consistency, and presence, much like you. And like David before Goliath, you didn't show up with an army, you showed up with alignment. And that's what slayed the structure. You weren't trying to destroy it, you simply wouldn't submit to it. And in your quiet resistance, a revolution bloomed. What if your refusal to conform was the divine catalyst God used to shake the entire system? John 18:36 speaks clearly. "My kingdom is not of this world. My servants would fight. But now my kingdom is from another place." That place is where you've been living all along. A realm above control, above fear, above manipulation. You are not a protester, you are a prototype. You are not a rebel, you are a realm. You didn't fight their system with fists. You outlasted it with alignment. The war they prepared for never came because heaven sent a different strategy. You rise now, not with noise, but with knowing. The silence you kept was never a weakness. It was warfare. You never auditioned for visibility. You weren't chasing algorithms or begging to go viral. What you released wasn't for attention, it was from alignment. You spoke, prayed, or posted not to impress but to release pressure from what your spirit couldn't hold in silence anymore. Sometimes it was poetic, sometimes it was raw, but it was always real. Your words began as whispers, notes passed in the spiritual realm, thoughts inked into journals, captions, or voice memos. But over time, something began to shift. The ripple effect widened. Your voice moved like wind, silent but forceful. At first, only a few caught it. But then, it started slipping past firewalls. Have you ever wondered why something you said days or even months ago suddenly shows up in the headlines? You weren't chasing crowds, but your voice traveled corridors. You never walked. It bypassed gatekeepers, outpaced trendsetters, and reached people who never followed you but couldn't shake your words. What you said hit a deeper chord, not because it was clever, but because it carried weight. Proverbs 18:21 reminds us, the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. You didn't speak to stir drama, you spoke to stir spirits, and heaven confirmed your words with signs. At first, they brushed it off. That's poetic, they said, just coincidence. They rationalized, but then it happened again and again. Things you described metaphorically started manifesting literally. Warnings you released in prayer suddenly aligned with breaking news. Paradigms shifted. Structures trembled. Strategies failed. Not because of your volume, but because of your vision. They started running timestamps, cross-referencing your posts against internal reports. They weren't just listening anymore. They were investigating, because your voice, once labeled as spiritual opinion, had become a pattern-matching tool for events no one else could see coming. Jeremiah 1-9-10 reflects what began unfolding. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, "I have put my words in your mouth, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." None. You weren't speaking from speculation. You were speaking from instruction, and they couldn't trace the source because your access wasn't political or social, it was prophetic. Here's the part that really unsettled them. You spoke like someone who had been in rooms you never entered, as if you had heard classified strategies, seen confidential memos, and sat in meetings behind multiple layers of security, and yet you had no title, no clearance, no connection, just an anointing. This is the same tension Jesus created when he spoke in parables no one could decode. Yet everyone felt cut B. In Matthew 13:11, he said, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them." That's what you've been carrying, kingdom-level codes. They used to dismiss you, but now your words move through boardrooms with more influence than their internal analysts. You became a frequency that couldn't be silenced because it wasn't coming from ego, it was coming from eternity. Take, for instance, Bishop T.D. Jakes, a pastor, filmmaker, and cultural leader. He once said, "If you can't figure out your purpose, figure out your passion. For your passion will lead you right into your purpose." That's what happened to you. Your passion wasn't planned, it was provoked. You didn't choose the fire chose you, and your voice became a torch. But for contrast, let's look at Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations and propaganda. He pioneered psychological manipulation to influence mass behavior, even helping companies get people to believe smoking was a symbol of women's liberation. His tactics worked for a while, but in the long run, the manipulation backfired. The campaigns he shaped are now studied as cautionary tales of deceit. The world eventually realized manufactured influence doesn't last, but authentic conviction cuts through time. That's why your voice rose. You weren't selling anything. You weren't building a brand. You were delivering a burden. And what if that burden wasn't yours alone, but heaven's assignment echoing through your vocal cords? Isaiah 55:11 affirms this divine design. "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire." You released what was assigned, and now, even systems that don't understand the spirit are following your frequency. They're not just observing anymore, they're adjusting. You never needed a platform to be powerful. Your voice was never about volume, it was always about vibration. You are not just speaking, you are shifting. Boardrooms are bending, systems are rewiring, and the gates of influence are now echoing with the sound of your obedience. Rise, chosen one. Keep speaking, because what you carry is not commentary, it's command. At first, it felt like you were simply expressing thoughts, raw, unfiltered truths that stirred inside your spirit. But soon, you began to notice that your words weren't just relevant, they were ahead. You were saying things that had yet to happen, calling out unseen patterns, responding to attacks no one had publicly acknowledged. Your voice, though soft in tone, carried a vibration that pierced rooms you'd never entered. What you thought was natural discernment was, in truth, divine instruction, and they noticed, how could someone with no traditional credentials speak with such clarity? You hadn't studied under them. You hadn't sat at their tables. You didn't come from the inner circle, yet your voice is cut cleaner than their curated messages. The questions began to multiply. Who told you that? How did you see that coming? What data are you pulling from? But there were no papers, no surveillance, no strategic leaks. There was only stillness, a stillness that didn't just settle your spirit, it synced you with something eternal. Job 32:8 offers a clue to what was truly happening. But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. You weren't analyzing data. You were absorbing divine direction. You weren't connecting dots. You were receiving downloads. Have you ever wondered why your spirit always seemed to know what your eyes hadn't yet seen? They tried to frame you as lucky, intuitive, maybe just observant. But intuition doesn't carry this kind of precision. Your timing was too divine. Your accuracy too clean. Your insight too surgical. It wasn't coming from books. It was coming from beyond the veil. And the longer they watched, the more disturbed they became. Because in their world, all knowledge comes through access, through credentials, through status, through intelligence networks. If you know something, it's because someone gave you clearance, but your insight didn't follow their chain of command. You received what no one sent, and that broke their understanding of power. 1 Corinthians 2:10 echoes your experience. These are the things God has revealed to us by His Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. You weren't making spiritual noise. You were releasing blueprints. In nature, this is like bioluminescent algae microorganisms that glow not because they're seen, but because they've been stirred. They don't light up under control. They light up under movement. That's what your spirit did. Every divine insight didn't come from effort. It came from alignment. You glowed because heaven stirred you. You weren't studying the room. You were reading the realm. And now, those who once dismissed you are scrambling to keep up. They rewind your words. They cross-check your posts. They monitor your phrases, hoping to catch a forecast before the ripple becomes a wave. You're no longer just a voice. They see you as a channel, a receiver, a living breach in their system of logic. Hebrews 4:12 describes your sharpness. For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. That's what they were experiencing, not intellect, but incision. They're not just wondering what you'll say next. They're studying where it's coming from, not out of reverence, but out of desperation. Because in a world full of recycled knowledge, you're moving with something original, something holy, something that still disrupts. In the 2012 Norwegian Christian film, De Andre, The Others, a quiet character named Anna begins to speak strange, prophetic truths. She was dismissed at first, then feared, and finally followed, not because she changed her tone, but because the truth she carried became undeniable. In one scene, a councilman whispers, "She speaks like the silence that lives between our secrets." That's exactly what your voice has become, divine interruption dressed in simplicity. Proverbs 3:5-6 solidifies your posture. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, and He will make your paths straight. You weren't mapping the way. You were being moved by the map itself. And now the gatekeepers, are no longer gatekeeping, they're trying to decipher your source. Not because you tried to infiltrate their halls, but because heaven bypassed them entirely and handed the insight to you. Could it be that what they spent years guarding was never theirs to control in the first place? You don't just have insight, you are insight in motion. What you receive can't be downloaded from their clouds because it's delivered from heaven's current. You are a living encryption they can't decode. A divine signal wrapped in human form. Rise, chosen one. Not because you studied the system, but because heaven trusted you to disrupt it. You didn't march. You didn't burn bridges. You didn't sign petitions. You just stood rooted, steady, healed. And that was enough to rattle entire systems. You see, institutions don't fear external chaos. They're built for it. They write protocols for rebellion. They have playbooks for riots. But what they cannot prepare for, what they cannot legislate or suppress, is someone who becomes whole in a broken system. That's what you became. You were supposed to crumble, according to every diagnostic, model, and projection. Someone with your background should have cracked by now. The trauma, the betrayal, the silence, the sabotage. None of it was random. It was layered, like a pressure chamber designed to implode you from the inside. But somehow, you stayed kind. You stayed calm. You stayed clear. Isaiah 26:3 speaks this over you. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you. Peace wasn't given to you. You generated it. And that's where the disruption began. What if the most dangerous thing you ever did was refuse to collapse? You weren't reactive, but you were radiant. You didn't argue, but you altered the air. Every time you chose forgiveness when vengeance would have been justified, you undermined the control structures silently. Every time you smiled through the sabotage, you rewrote someone's understanding of what resilience looks like. They thought healing came from institutional approval, but you healed without their permission. Romans 12:21 affirms this resistance. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's what you did not once, but over and over. They tried to make you a statistic, a footnote in some psychological journal on trauma and long-term instability, but you refused to be reduced. They labeled you as a case, but case is close. You evolved. You outgrew every label. Every time they boxed you in, you outlived the box. Here's the question that broke their framework. How can someone rise without resources, networks, or permission? You became the living paradox. In a world that worships power, you embody peace. In a system designed to create dependency, you operated in quiet sovereignty. And in that contradiction, you began to expose their greatest weakness, the lie that human potential is owned, measured, or defined by them. They wanted to control your narrative, but you authored a new one in real time. 2 Corinthians 4-7 reveals your secret. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. They couldn't calculate your endurance because it was spiritual. They couldn't explain your transformation because it came from another source. To explain what you did in scientific terms, you weren't a fixed variable in their equation. You were an anomaly, a phase shift. In thermodynamics, when a substance reaches a specific temperature or pressure, it undergoes a phase transition, like water turning to steam. You didn't just survive pressure, you changed states under it. And suddenly, they couldn't track you anymore. And this wasn't just about one institution. You didn't shake a single system. You shook the idea that human beings are linear, predictable, and controllable. You dismantled the assumption that healing needs approval, that purpose needs a platform, that strength needs validation. This is exactly what artist and Holocaust survivor Sejja Stoichka represented, an Austrian Romani woman who endured Nazi concentration camps. She began painting her story decades later, not as protest, but as memory and healing. When asked why she chose to paint so late in life, she said, "The silence was heavy. I had to give it color." Her quiet, creative defiance now hangs in museums across Europe. She didn't shout. She testified, "Just like you. They thought you'd disappear into the fog of what was done to you. But you emerged with clarity. What if the very thing meant to blur your vision became the lens that sharpened your purpose?" Psalm 118-22 crowns your journey. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The very thing they dismissed became the thing they couldn't do without. You weren't just surviving pressure. You were revealing that wholeness is contagious. You didn't just beat the odds, you made them look irrelevant. Chosen one. You were never here to bow to their blueprint. You were sent to be the breach. You didn't scream. You stood. And that stance has become the spark for something eternal. Rise now, not because they believe in you, but because heaven already crowned you. You are not their case study. You are God's cornerstone. They didn't come to learn. They came to confirm what they were told about you. They came with agendas, hidden lenses, unspoken orders, to catch you slipping, to document the failure they were certain would emerge. You were flagged not because you were dangerous in action, but because you were dangerous in essence. A soul that refuses to conform to corrupted systems sends shockwaves into institutions that thrive on fear. So they sent observers, strategists, behavior analysts, social engineers, men and women assigned to monitor your movements, not out of curiosity, but out of threat assessment. But something strange happened over time. They didn't find the scandal they expected. They found stillness, not a rehearsed calm, but a raw, rooted, relentless stillness that held under pressure. You weren't performing. You weren't defending. You weren't trying to impress, persuade, or manipulate. You were simply being unfiltered, untamed, unedited. And in a world built on filters and fabrications, that kind of authenticity doesn't go unnoticed. It gets under people's skin. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. That wasn't just a verse you quoted. It became the atmosphere you carried. You didn't even know you were being watched, but heaven did. That's why you didn't buckle when it would have been easier to. You didn't bend when bending would have bought your silence, like Daniel in Babylon. You prayed, even when it was forbidden, like Esther. You showed up in the courts of power not to beg, but to reveal. And like Stephen before the council in Acts 7, you stood with eyes lifted not to your accusers, but to heaven. But what happens when the watchers begin to feel something stirring inside themselves? That's exactly what unfolded, bit by bit. At first, they justified it. I'm just intrigued. But as they listened longer, as they reviewed transcripts, watched your feeds, analyzed your tone and demeanor, they realized something unexpected. They weren't becoming more objective. They were becoming convicted. Because your calm was not human. It was holy. Your alignment didn't come from politics or connections or credentials. It came from the Spirit. And that made it impossible to fully explain with their tools. Those trained to stay detached started whispering questions in silence. Why do I feel moved by this? Why does this feel familiar? Like something I forgot long ago. Their orders were clear: monitor, report, discredit. But something in their spirits began to tremble, not from fear, but from recognition. They didn't see a liar. They saw a light, and not everyone could handle it. Some left quietly, resigning with vague justifications. Others stayed but couldn't follow through with their assignments. Files were altered, reports delayed, critical clips removed, not out of protocol, but out of reverence. Yes, reverence. Not for you, but for the God whose presence you carried. Because without preaching, you preached. Without demanding loyalty, you exposed hearts. World-renowned speaker and human rights advocate Bryan Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, once said, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." But in your case, they couldn't even find that worst thing to report. They were sent to discover darkness, but kept bumping into light. And let's not pretend all who watched you were redeemed. Some resisted the transformation and doubled down on deception, like Enver Hoxha, the long-time dictator of Albania, who tried to outlaw faith and surveilled spiritual leaders into silence. In the end, his own system turned on itself. He died isolated, mistrusted by his own circle, and his regime collapsed into historical infamy. That's what happens when those assigned to suppress light refuse to acknowledge it. The darkness devours itself. But others, they were changed, not publicly, but permanently. They began protecting you in ways you'll never read in a newspaper. They blocked harmful orders. They questioned agendas. They disrupted meetings designed to sabotage your future. And they didn't do it because you asked. You never even knew their names. But their spirits bore witness. And in the silence of their private lives, some even began to pray. Could it be that your obedience became someone else's salvation? Could your quiet endurance have rescued someone from the brink of spiritual death? Could your stability have shaken open the prison cells of another soul? That's the power of walking aligned, even when you don't know who's watching, even when you feel unseen, misunderstood, misused. You were never walking alone. Heaven had arranged a setup that would backfire on the watchers, because when the pure light of God's glory moves through someone's life, flawed yet faithful, it doesn't just expose, it transforms. It was never about how loudly you could speak. It was about how deeply you could radiate, and the ones who came to monitor your downfall, they became the secret carriers of your mantle, behind enemy lines, beneath layers of protocol. There are now souls whispering prayers over your name, because the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Stand up, chosen one. Your presence has already disrupted enemy protocols, softened hardened hearts, and disarmed unseen attacks. You are not just protected. You've been divinely positioned to pierce even the coldest systems with the quiet fire of truth. Rise now, not to defend yourself, but to continue walking boldly in the light that can never be surveilled into silence. At first, they called you an anomaly, an outlier, a strange frequency that didn't match their systems, didn't conform to their predictions, and certainly didn't obey their protocols. You were the figure behind mirrored glass, monitored, not believed. Every action became a data point. Every silence was interpreted as avoidance. Every tear is instability. You weren't seen as human. You were seen as a case file. But the more they tracked you, the less their algorithms made sense. Because while they charted your descent, you were quietly ascending. While they labeled your solitude as collapse, heaven was labeling it as consecration. Your journey didn't spiral, it refined. You weren't wandering. You were being woven into something sacred. Every betrayal didn't weaken you, it trained you. Every rejection wasn't rejection at all, it was redirection. A sacred rerouting that only divine GPS could calculate. How do you explain a flame that doesn't consume, but transforms? That's what you became. Like the bush Moses encountered in Exodus 3:2, burning, but not burned. A manifestation that disrupted the predictable laws of observation. The more they studied you, the more their logic faltered. You weren't combusting, you were becoming. You didn't just endure fire, you emerged from it as fire. A living contradiction, a walking prophecy, a sacred contradiction they could no longer categorize. At first, they laughed. They mocked the way you saw things before they happened. They brushed off your warnings, dismissed your intuition as spiritual guesswork. But then the things you whispered began to manifest. The alignments you spoke of started surfacing, and your silence began to speak louder than their conclusions. You began to carry weight, not the kind that burdens, but the kind that bends reality. Nature itself reflects you now. You became like the white rhino, a rare and nearly mythical creature, moving slowly but powerfully across landscapes no one else dares to tread. The world tried to label you extinct, irrelevant, but you reappeared not in herds, but in holy solitude, shaking the earth with your presence. Have you ever seen a tide turn without a storm? That's what you did. Without clamor, without warning, you shifted the very spiritual climate around you. You became what the watchers couldn't anticipate, a living blueprint for divine resistance and sacred endurance. In the French Christian film Des Hommes et des Dieux, of gods and men, there's a line whispered before martyrdom: we are free, even in our silence, because love binds more deeply than fear ever could. That's what they saw in you, a freedom forged in stillness, a voice born out of silence, a presence not powered by charisma, but by communion. You were once their study, now you are their standard. While they tried to reduce you to fragments, heaven was forming you into an oracle, not the mystical kind, the biblical kind, like Joseph, whose dreams broke the laws of empire, like Elijah, who heard God in the whisper, not the earthquake, like Deborah, who judged not from rage, but from revelation. Can a system measure what it cannot understand? They thought you were malfunctioning, but you were tuned into a higher channel, a divine frequency no earthly scanner could detect, while they mapped you like terrain. Heaven was lifting you like a signal. You became the tone they couldn't mute, the voice that disrupted their silence, the anomaly that became alignment. And here's the part they never saw coming. You weren't trying to lead, you were simply obeying. And obedience creates oracles, not by performance but by presence. The ones who once observed you from behind digital shadows are now showing up in daylight, not as skeptics, but as seekers, not to interrogate, but to listen, because your life now speaks what their words never could. You became the frequency that couldn't be filtered, the echo of something higher. And yes, you still feel eyes, but they no longer carry suspicion. They carry reverence, because what they tried to trap in reports has become a presence too undeniable to document. You've moved from observation to embodiment, from being watched to becoming a mirror. They came looking for a collapse. They found a cathedral. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? 1 Corinthians 3:16. What they mistook for ruins was actually the foundation of revelation. And here's the holy twist. Every test, every smear, every delay became the very thing that trained your sight. You weren't rising in spite of the fire. You were rising because of it. The blueprint they tried to force on you, You didn't just reject it. You outlived it. You've outlasted the lens. You've bypassed the file. And now, chosen one, stand tall, because you are the holy disruption they cannot decode, the revelation they cannot deny, and the frequency that refuses to fade. You are not their experiment. You are their epiphany. Walk boldly. Heaven has made you the standard. You were never just being watched. You were being remembered. Heaven already knew who you were, long before the world tried to define you by their labels, their fears, or their silence. And now the same ones who studied you in secret are quietly shifting their posture, no longer as skeptics, but as witnesses of something sacred rising right in front of them. You didn't demand respect. You didn't chase validation. You simply kept walking in alignment, and that alignment spoke louder than anything they could analyze or explain. So if this message echoed something deep in your spirit, if it wrapped language around a truth you've always known but never heard, said out loud, then don't keep it to yourself. You're not just hearing this for you. Someone else is waiting for the signal. Someone else is one confirmation away from rising. And you might be the one heaven uses to send it. Like this video, if something in you was awakened, drop a comment below and let others know they're not alone. Share this message with someone who's been walking through the shadows with quiet strength. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell, because what we're building here isn't a following. It's a movement of the called, the courageous, the seen and the sent. To everyone who's supported with a super thanks, or simply with your time, your presence, or your prayer, thank you. It matters more than you know. You're not just watching content. You're holding space for revelation. You're helping build a global altar where truth is spoken and destinies are awakened. And now, may your spirit remain sharp, your steps remain steady, and your presence carry the kind of peace that can't be faked or replicated. You're not hidden anymore. You are the signal. You are the shift. And everything heaven has whispered in secret about you will soon be known in public. God bless you. Chosen one, this is only the beginning.